Welcome back. Our next panel will focus on early childhood education. Our moderator is Miranda, Chairman of the Center for Civil Society, founder of IDFC Private Equity, and trustee of the University of Chicago Trust in India. Louis devotes most of his time to capacity building for not-for-profit organizations and recently also started the Indian School for Public Policy. As an alum of the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, he remains a strong supporter of our work here in India. Louis.
Thank you, Aditi. And well, we're in the second half of the day. My journey into early childhood education got picked up only a few years back. When I quit working, I was focusing a lot on higher education because that's what I thought was important. And then I got involved with an NGO called Sneha. And they do work with child nutrition. And that's when I learned that if kids don't get proper nutrition between the age of 0 and 3, whatever you do with their education after that is sort of stunted because they're already stunted and malnourished here. And then I got familiar with the work of Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, who's famous among educationists for the Heckman equation. And when we opened the center 5 years back, we had Jim come down and speak at that. So we've been talking about early childhood education right from when the center opened. And I then asked him to come and do a talk with a whole bunch of people from the education field, which he did at that time. And so I'm glad that we're back over here 5 years later, still talking about early child education. But there have been positives, like, for example, the new education policy talks for the first time, I think, about early childhood education. And we're going to get to talk about this a lot more over the next hour or so. So the format we're going to follow is each of our panelists are going to introduce themselves briefly and talk about something that I kickstart the conversation with them. And then we sort of have a larger discussion and engage with, I would love to get your thoughts also into this. So on my left immediately is Rukmini Banerjee. Her claim to fame is she got a PhD from University of Chicago and then they shut down that department. I don't know the cause. The correlation I don't know about, but the causation. But and Rukmini I've known for many years, and like a lot of us at University of Chicago, we did know the University of Chicago connection in common. And then when we got talking about it, and I said, listen, you need to come and see the center in Chicago. And as Rukmini was saying, she's now sort of using this a lot more, which is fabulous. But as you introduce yourself, Rukmini, I'll also like you to cover about the organization you now run, Pratham, has been extremely successful. And you've relied a lot of your work has been based on data that you'll have collected, and you'll have worked also very closely with both Banerji and Duflo. So could you just talk to us also about the role data-based research has played in your growth story?
Okay. So since I have this PhD, which we are not sure we should talk about, I'll talk about a pre-PhD phase. No, more seriously, I think my first exposure to early childhood actually happened in Chicago. I was like many Indians of my generation, didn't give too much thought to anything, got a scholarship, was going to Chicago, and then I thought, I don't want to go to school right now, so maybe I'll go maybe they'll differ, which they did. But I arrived in Chicago in December, and there was not much you can do in Chicago in December. So I thought maybe I should make myself useful and just volunteer somewhere close by. And I was happy to volunteer, but my criteria was it should be 1 block from where I was, so that I didn't have to walk too far in the cold. So I actually spent 8 months in a YWCA, which ran a daycare center in a low-income neighborhood. And it really was a big education for me because it wasn't the America that I had read about and seen movies on. The oldest mother, I was at the time perhaps 22 or something, and most of the mothers of my kids there were substantially younger than me. And so it was like a whole education. And then later on, after I entered the University of Chicago and got settled in, my kids went to the lab school, which I think is probably one of, we were just discussing with Susan, I mean, there are probably people here whose kids have been there, you know, just the exact other extreme of what early childhood should be. To the extent that my younger son is now 29 and his kindergarten teacher is still in touch with him. So I think in Chicago we saw, you know, both sides of what is possible and what we should think about. So I work for Pratham, which I've done ever since I came back from Chicago. Luckily, Pratham is still around. We haven't shut down. Maybe that will happen, but not yet. But the first thing that, the first couple of years of Pratham, we started actually with very frugal early childhood centers in Bombay. And the idea was that if every child in Bombay could go to a preschool, then you were guaranteed that every child would go to primary school. This was in the mid-90s. And so in the first couple of years that we worked, when I arrived in Bombay in 96, we ran about 150 balwadis, basically. And we thought it was, you know, there were all these discussions about quality and, you know, how do we do better and blah, 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 and this was scale. And then by 98, there were 3,500 balwadis that we had to support, and we were still having the same conversations about, you know, and so I realized that this whole scale business is kind of a ephemeral thing. It's always a step ahead of where you're at. So when you're at 150, you think you're scale. When you're at 3,000, you think you're scale. When you're all over India, you think you're on scale. So it's a very flexible kind of a notion. And we've continued as Pratham to be very invested in kind of doing things early. The USR report, which is quite well known, at least to those in India, has typically focused on basic reading and math, and for the age group more or less from class 1 to class 8 kind of age range. It's a household survey. But after doing it for 10 years in every rural district in India, we decided that we need a little bit of breathing room to actually be able to think and be able to do you know, other things as well. So every alternate year now we focus on a different age group or a different dimension of education. So 2019 USR is focused on the age group 4 to 8. So I'm very happy to be here on this panel in this year, because we are also getting lots of new experiences of looking at what 4 to 8 year olds are doing in India, can do. And we think it's also will hopefully feed into, hopefully the draft new education policy will become the education policy, at least for the early years. Because there I think that the stress is on looking at this as a continuum. And if you do things right to begin with, then, you know, we will all go to the University of Chicago.
And what about the role of data in the work that you'll do?
So I think that we've been very, you know, right from the beginning, the two founders of Pratham were university-based people. One is a chemist and one is actually was a vice principal of the College of Social Work in Bombay. So there has been always a kind of a more analytical, perhaps, framing. We've depended a lot on our ways of measurement to kind of guide us along the way. And so we have a lot of internal measurements that we've done right from the beginning. And then around about 1999 or 2000, these two young people came to visit us. And since they were not from Chicago, I was very skeptical. And they were from MIT. It was not clear why MIT folks need to come to the slums of Bombay and look at, you know, whatever we were doing. But luckily we were, you know, other people on my team were more open-minded than I was. And so we've partnered with Abhijit and Esther now for almost 20 years. And they have been very helpful also in helping us understand impacts of the bigger programs. Those have been generally on primary schools. And I think helped in making it more effective, more you know, applicable. So their contribution has been quite big. But I would say that even internally we were quite, perhaps because of the origins, you know, inclined towards, we were very focused on outcomes, and I think we looked quite skeptically at ourselves to say if you're not reaching the outcomes you want to reach, then you have to change what you're doing. And that has been, I think, very helpful in our growth.
Sure. And that's what Gene Farmer, my professor, said, that, you know, you got to be driven by the results of your research and not alter your research to get the results that you premeditated, you earlier wanted you. And that's really following where the data goes from. Susan, I first met in Beijing in 2010 at the opening of the Beijing Center. And it's great to have you here again. And we talked last night a bit about the role of households in kids' education. So as you introduce the work you're doing, could you also talk to us a bit more about the role of the family in kids' education?
Well, thanks, Louis. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be on this panel and to hear about the great work that's going on in India. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. I'm in the Department of Psychology and also Comparative and Human Development. And the work I do is really grounded in laboratory studies. You know, for many, many years, that's where I did my work, studying, you know, how kids learn concepts, learn mathematics, how they learn language. And more recently, I've faced that same problem that was talked about in the first panel, is how do you take the research findings, the way children learn, and make a difference in the world, not just, you know, write our articles in our journals and have our colleagues read them. We want to, you know, be relevant and really make a difference. So this research to practice issue, I think, is one where I've been focusing my work in the last years, both in terms of families that Louis mentioned, how can we help families help their kids, and also in terms of the classroom. I have a project with several of my colleagues, Steve Raudenbush and Susan Golden Meadow, called Getting on Track for School Success, where we're in classrooms and we have an assessment instruction system that's based on data, knowing, you know, what these 3- and 4-year-olds know at any particular point in time, and then using instructional strategies to meet them where they're at and to bring them along known learning trajectories. And we recently had a chance to do a randomized controlled trial of that system and found that it was successful in closing about a quarter of the achievement gap between, you know, kids who come from households that have a lot of resources compared to children who are growing up in poverty. So there's a lot of, I think, promise to this approach, so that, you know, teachers aren't going into the classroom with these 3- and 4-year-olds and thinking that they all are at the same place when they enter preschool. And, you know, gearing the instruction to the right place for the kids. It's not just that you're 3, so you should, you know, be doing and learning certain things. It depends on, you know, the inputs that you've been getting in the home environment, which brings me around to what you asked me to address. I was also part of a longitudinal language project which started 15 years ago, and our population was a diverse sample of the children growing up in the Chicago area, and the kids were 14 months old when they entered the study, and the whole family was entered into the study, and parents were told that we would be visiting their households every 4 months. The kids are now 15 years old. But for the first 5 years, we went 3 times a year, every 4 months, and we videotaped interactions for 90 minutes and then used the last half hour to do some assessments. But we just told the parents to do what they normally would do. And what we found is enormous differences in what families actually do with the kids and what their experiences are like. And I'll just throw out one example and then be quiet for a while. But you know, one of my interests has been on mathematical development because it forms the foundation for STEM learning. And what we found, if you extrapolate, you know, what we heard during the times of our observations between 14 and 30 months of age, so when the kids were from 1 to 2.5 years of age, basically, is that in the households where parents were using what I'll call number talk, you know, and I don't mean, you know, any kind of worksheets or anything like that, but saying, you know, there's 2 bottles on the table, you know, or, you know, can you count them, 1, 2, that kind of thing with these really little kids. The kids who would hear a lot of number talk would be exposed to more than 100,000 number words in a year. And at the low end, kids would be exposed to only 15,000. So, you know, you have this huge difference of more than a 6-fold difference in the input. So when we talk about the achievement gap, we're not talking about the kid themselves. This is how I think about it. We're talking about a huge input gap, and that's what I feel like I want to address. We need to close that and help all kids reach their potential.
Thank you, Susan. And finally, we have Amukha. who I got to meet only yesterday, but I've heard about the school that she ran in Chennai for many years because my cousin's kids went over there. It was the first sort of full stream Montessori school. So Amukha, as you sort of talk about some of the work you do, it'll also be interesting if you could tell us a bit about how you've been able to introduce Montessori methods. First of all, tell us what Montessori methods are, and then also how you've been able to bring them into the schools in Tamil Nadu through the program that you're working with.
Well, I see myself as a teacher, and I think even now, working with children, working with teachers, there have been moments, very special moments and discovery moments even now, and that's very precious to me. I work with teacher development, and we have a one-year course in Montessori course for the elementary school. Very often Montessori is only for the pre-primary and preschools, but here we have for the elementary school, classes 1 to 8. So we train teachers, working teachers, for a year or so. I've also worked with the government in Tamil Nadu, as Louis said, and I'll talk a little bit in detail about that. I've been in the CABE committee many years ago, and I think that's the kind of a policy making highest kind of a committee for education in India. And part of the NCF also 2005, not the recent one, thankfully, and also being part of some committees for assessment, etc. So I'm coming from there, and maybe I'll focus on maybe Montessori. Montessori in a way is, I think it's a well-known word, but some people, we need to unwrap it a little bit because it's if you hear the word Montessori, people think only of a nursery education. It's mainly, I feel it's, put it right for this context, you create an environment where children act. You create a kind of a prepared environment where the teacher also is a facilitator and is an enabling kind of a position rather than a direct teaching. So one assumes that children love to learn, and that's where we start. Whereas if you see the regular schools, conventional schools, I don't call them traditional, but conventional, the assumption is children don't like to learn, and so that has to be force-fed. Or if you look at the alternative sector in education, they feel also the same assumption is there that children don't like to learn, but it has to be made fun and games. So for both the regular and the alternative, the assumptions are that children don't like to learn. But we start with the assumption and the mainstay that children love to learn. So starting from there, we create whatever children are interested in, and they're interested in whatever human beings have learned over the years, and human beings have developed over the years. So it could be language, arithmetic, zoology, botany, whatever human beings have done. Children are young human beings, and they want to learn what is in their mind. So very often Montessori is criticized for giving a little too much for the children, whereas in nursery schools they start reading, writing much later. In Montessori schools, if you see, their children start reading, writing into academic kind of work quite early. But part of it is also their choice, and the choice is very critical for a Montessori environment. So when we had this opportunity in Tamil Nadu government, and before that actually in Karnataka, where the government invited us to work with panchayat schools in Karnataka, we said let's have the elements of Montessori in a public school. So the elements meant that there should be a choice where children choose an activity, children choose what they want to learn, and there's a prepared environment for those children. When we initially started off, both in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka was the panchayat schools, whereas in the Tamil Nadu it was the department schools run by the education department. So we started off with we felt that just talking about change, bringing about a change is not enough. We have to help them to see that happen. So whatever was the nearest government school, we asked the headmaster or the headmistress to give us about 30 children from class 1 to 5 and we set up a demo classroom, what we called it at that time. And we had different kinds of materials around the class, and we got the children into the class. The kind of materials we had there were newspapers, old magazines, sometimes an old typewriter, some Montessori materials for language and maths, and some material maybe children were familiar with in their schools, even textbooks. So then we brought the children into the class. We had observers around, mostly from the government schools, and we told the children that this is our classroom, and all this belongs to all of us. And let's see what we can do here. And I said, wherever we go, we have some rules. So here too, we have some ground rules. If we have play cricket, we have some rules. If we go to somebody's house, there's some rules. So here we have some rules. And so I said, we have, this was all in Tamil or Kannada, the local languages. So we told them that the first rule is that there's so many of us working here. There are about 30 children and observers also. And we said we have to talk softly. So that was one rule. And the other rule was, I said the second rule was that all this belongs to us, so you can go around and choose with your heart. And the third was, I said you work with it as long as you want, but put it back exactly where you took it. So when we started these in the demo schools, with this the children went to choose. And of course, in the first round, they did not choose anything because they've been dinned into them that not to touch anything. You know, last 1 year or 2 years or 5 years, they've been told not to touch things. So here we said we had to encourage them to touch. And once they touched and discovered some things, they worked with the material, and for 3 hours we couldn't lift our heads because we were busy with the children. Children were occupied, and this happened repeatedly. Wherever we went to do the demo classes and helped government schools to see what could be and how children could learn, it happened all the time. And I felt from there, observers of course used to tell us that we rehearsed with the children. You know, you must have had a rehearsal earlier and then done it for us. We said, no, this is the way children learn. And it's nothing to be, for me also it was a trial, like, you know, we didn't know what would happen. It happened that way. Say that how children learn is important.
Thanks.
And from there we took it on to the government.
Thank you, Amukha. So, the government's also looking a lot more at the role of early childhood education. My wife just spent 2 weeks in Ladakh, where she is on the board of an organization called 17,000 Feet Foundation, which does a lot of work with Asad and Pratham Books. And so they've set up interesting classrooms for ICDS, and she's sending me pictures about the excitement by both the students, the teachers, and the village headmen over there. And I was talking yesterday to the secretary who started the Sarva Shiksha, the government's school rollout system, and asked him why is it that the government hadn't focused a lot on early childhood education in the earlier years. And his point was just because we didn't have the funds. But it's interesting now that the national new education policy talks a lot about early childhood education, or starts talking about it. Could some of you sort of talk a bit about what is it that they should be focusing on? What's the role that you could also play in terms of nudging it to get to having a better focus on this critical part, which, as we've all learned, is the best return on investment in the education sphere. Any suggestions for the new education policy or what we should be doing?
So they're listening right now. I think that just picking up from what we've been saying, which I think are well accepted, almost common sense things, is that you can't have a child being educated without really involving the family. And I think in our case, a large part of it is that the young child's mother is also quite young, and within the family hierarchy, she's often the most hard pressed for time. And so, going back to what Susan was saying, when you look at what what is the interaction between the mother and the child, even in these formative years. It's very often instructional. Don't do this, do that, and you're very busy doing other things. So I think one big part of what we are doing, and we have to figure out how, on a systemic basis, you bring this up, is how do you give time for families actually to have productive interactions with their children, which is learning on both sides. It's not only that you're learning, it's not only that the child is learning. An example of this, and the reason I'm citing it is because in our own programs we've done it, but we also work a lot with the government of Himachal and government of Punjab. These are two governments who brought in a pre-primary class into their primary school system. In our own programs, we've been doing what we call these school readiness melas, which are actually public, which are in the community, and you kind of have a whole series of activity booths almost, where the way we structure it is that you have the mother and the child. You can't come alone. Mother can't come alone, child can't come alone. You have to have the mother and the child come together. Usually kids who are going to first grade, but it's not hard and fast. You do a bunch of activities together. So for example, you do classification, which can be done with potatoes, onions, tomatoes, separate them out. You may do something about putting things in some series, which, with local material. And we find that mothers almost enjoy it more than the children, and the siblings are involved. And at the end of this process, if possible, you have some influential person, maybe the village headman or the headwoman, give a little, recognition. We love certificates in India. So you get a little certificate to the mother and the child saying, well done. Now, these are kinds of things where I think it's partly to demonstrate that there's a breadth of skills that are important. We are plagued in India by our aspiration for education, where you want to do homework at age 2 and start becoming numerate at, at a very early age. But the fact that there is a whole variety of activities that can help to really build your entire platform, your entire kind of development spectrum, and that this can be done in a very normal, everyday way, I think is a big message that needs to go. And so, among the many things that I think will be proposed, one is that the families must have a central. And just because you are, as a mother or a father, haven't had much years of schooling, doesn't mean that you can't engage. So no matter what great curriculum you have to have doors which are more open. I think a second thing, there are many things, and I don't want to. The second thing I think is that there's a real danger of schooling going into lower ages. So therefore, I, for example, find the words preschool a problem. It should be called. In fact, it should be the other way around, like what Amukha is saying, is that the things that we do in our early childhood programs should permeate upwards, rather than schooling type things permeating downwards. And it doesn't help in India that we have different departments that handle this age group before 5 or 6 is handled by one department, and then the school. And so how we are going to bridge that divide, where really you look at a continuum from 3 to 8 or 4 to 8 in a very kind of continuous way, I think is going to be a big challenge. I think there are a lot of people doing very interesting work in this area in India, and I'm sure abroad as well. But we've got to sort of open up this space both to the family, both to what kinds of activities are important, and structurally to departments which are, we are always told to collaborate, and we've seen examples of collaboration from the morning between academia and practitioners. The hardest collaborations are between two government departments. And I think that has to be led with charisma and with leadership to say that these are, we have 25 million children in each age group. You're already talking about, 150 million lives at this age group. If you don't take it seriously, University of Chicago will expand its campus in Beijing.
But you talked about how difficult it is for two government departments to collaborate. I think it's as difficult for two NGOs also to collaborate sometimes here. Because each one is so passionate about what they do and believes so strong in their cause and their solution. But we'll come back to that later. So Amukha, do you have any sort of thoughts?
I'll expand maybe again on Tamil Nadu, what we worked on. We focused a lot on not to give on what, but how to do things. So we started with the teacher development faculty at the diets. Every district has a institute of training in India, and we started with the faculty there. And we, besides my first lecture, We did not give any lectures at all. It was through a dialogue and we called it a Socratic dialogue and discussion that we evolved a program. So we evolved a program for the teacher faculty. Then we trained about, with me there, we trained about 1,000 people, teachers, BRCs, AEOs. BRCs are the block level people, the AEOs are the area administrators. So we worked with both mixing up the academic and the administrators because we felt that's where we need to break hierarchy. So we did a multiple kind of things on how to do things rather than on what, because the what is there already. But the how and the culture of schooling and the culture of deschooling needs to be come into the practice of it. So I feel that worked well, and we worked with initially with 13 government schools in the city of Chennai, and then the government. Ours was not a big, big NGO. We were very few people. We said the government has to step in immediately, and they have to put into practice all that. So we developed a core group, and the core group worked with the teachers. Mm-hmm. So it was a kind of a core group, and the core group also multiplied organically, so that they at the end of I think 1 year they trained about 2 lakh teachers and about 30,000 administrators. So that's the kind of organic training, and right through the training there were no lectures as such, more of a discussion on how to do things. The other is we arrived at milestones. What are children capable of? Because I felt that's one of the most important areas is that children are underestimated for what they can do, what they're capable of. They're treated as, I was telling Susan, like partial imbeciles, that they have to be told even to turn the page of a book. So what are children capable of? People have to.
Thank you.
Those are some things that should be informed with them.
Thank you, Susan. I know you may not be that familiar with the NEP, but are there any thoughts that you had based on your own research, for example, on math anxiety, etc., that you could suggest that we look at in India?
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of relates to some of the themes that have come up already, but this two-generation approach is very important, and certainly teacher training, that you mentioned, but also involving the family. But recognition that kids are influenced heavily by the adults around them, their parents, their teachers. They're looking to them, and it's not just about the knowledge that they're gaining from interacting with the adults, but the attitudes that they're gaining about learning and about does your parent expect you to be successful at school, not school broadly, but also in particular areas, and just about every certainly the OECD data shows that in every country there's a lot of math anxiety, and there is a literature on this in India too. I've been reading a couple of articles, and actually an article by someone in India was the first to show that there's these intergenerational effects of math anxiety. So if a parent is anxious about math, that they didn't like it in school, they didn't have a good experience, they don't think that they can do it, it's very common for their child to also hold those attitudes. And once you have that attitude that math is a scary thing, this is associated with doing poorly in math and avoiding math. And one thing that we found recently in my lab is that we were interested in, how is this unfolding to the kids? And we found that math-anxious parents, even when they're talking to a 3-year-old, are less likely to talk about number than a parent who's not math-anxious. So it starts really early, and I think that these attitudes that we're conveying, not just the math anxiety, but stereotypes that we hold about math, that some groups are better than others, that boys are better than girls, all of these can have negative effects. On the other hand, there's the positive side. If you're enthusiastic about the subject and you're giving feedback, when a kid doesn't do well, can't solve a problem, let's say, let's try to talk about this and think about it like we would talk about any other issue, and come up with ways of doing it.
Yeah, when you talked about kids being influenced by adults, I was smiling because Bala and I were just talking about this earlier this morning, and we're talking about teenagers, and it's so even more relevant to young kids. And Parth and I have been also talking about the impact that our own behavior has on our kids, because kids, anyone? Gender of the child. Does the gender of the child have a role to play in early childhood education?
There's an excellent book written by Vivian Paley, who was a teacher at a kindergarten teacher at University of Chicago Lab School, called Superheroes in the Doll Corner. And I've read it a long time ago, but I think it is a wonderful kind of diary almost, where she tries at the beginning of the year to make sure that kids play kind of, all kids can play similar things. And how the kids fox her at every step. And the boys start playing, whatever, with guns, and the girls start playing with dolls. And it's a year-long experiment where she continuously tries, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So it's a great book. It's one person's journey of trying to figure out how do you get the gender stuff, to operate in a different way. And I would highly recommend it.
I'll just add on to that. When you look at most skills that kids have, language, math, I mean, there's no gender differences, early on, except in one domain. And there's some evidence, although I want to emphasize that I'm going to tell you that boys on average do a little bit better than girls on some tests of spatial thinking, like visualizing what something would look like when you rotate it. But it's not the case that the boys are here and the girls are here. They're two, very overlapped distributions. So, the best girls are up with the best boys. But we don't really understand exactly why there's this difference. One of the things that Vivian Paley wrote about is that, boys spend more time in the block corner. They play with blocks more. And in a lot of preschool classrooms in the United States anyway, kids, they go around and they can do whatever they want during their free activity time. So if the boys want to play blocks, they play blocks. The girls want to play with dolls, they play dolls. But there's a growing literature that shows that in terms of going into the STEM disciplines, that a high level of spatial thinking is a predictor, even if you control for your verbal and math skills. So if we believe that, there's also evidence that if you engage in spatial activities like playing with blocks, that builds your spatial thinking. So we wouldn't let kids opt out of learning to read. So in my view, we should, if we really believe that this spatial thinking is an important part of your, sort of cognitive toolkit, we should make sure that every kid has a chance to, have those experiences with the blocks. And I think that the boys could probably benefit from playing with the dolls a little bit too.
But if I can just add, it's also what the kids, as we've been saying, what kids see around them. So, for example, in our assert assessment, a reading task, there is 4 simple lines, which is at a very easy level of reading. And I remember the particular 4 lines, and I'll say it in Hindi and I'll translate it for you. It said, शाम को पापा घर आते हैं, हाथ धो के खाना खाते हैं, माँ से बातें करते हैं और फिर सो जाते हैं. So dad comes home in the evening, he washes his hands and eats his food, he chats with mom, and then they go to sleep. And these were kids who were like maybe, not even first grade, second, third, and higher. It's a very easy 4 lines. The first line they could read quite fluently. Second line also, and third line, kid after kid was slowing down. There's nothing in the linguistics or the phonetics of it that's a problem. After the 5th or 6th kid, I said, what's the problem? And they said, ye nahi hota hai. My dad doesn't talk to my mom. So, it was not a reading problem. It was like you've written a stupid paragraph problem. Okay? Now, but it was a very big indicator that this is the norm that the kids are seeing, and so they're reacting accordingly. Now, if that is the case, what as a person who deals with young children, should I be doing, is I think the big question. So I think the kids are one way. It's what is around them that is shaping them in different ways.
I think, yeah, okay, we'll go to the next.
Okay, so there's a question here. Yeah. Wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Arvind. I'm with the University of Chicago, Booth student, alum rather. So my question is on connected to that spatial thinking that you talked about a little bit. And is there any evidence of the age playing a criteria here? You spoke about it, and it starts, especially the STEM orientation, and how early does it start? How late can it, does it subside? And when should one focus on that? And what would be a good way to, inculcate that?
I don't think that there's any, critical evidence of a critical period, that you can't learn something later. For language, that's our best evidence that, we're better language learners early. But for something like spatial skills, actually there's evidence that you can improve your spatial thinking throughout your lifetime. If you practice, engage in certain kinds of activities. But that said, skills beget skills. So, if you, have some good spatial thinking skills, you might do more, construction things or play with puzzles more, build things, and, this sort of builds on itself. And it also, we have some evidence that strong spatial thinkers, it actually supports numerical thinking. So, for example, kids who have better spatial visualization skills are better at this task called the number line task, where they have to put numbers at the right place on a number line, which is a very spatial representation of number. So, I'm kind of a believer that you provide opportunities for kids. You give them the chance to engage and learn, that you can't force it. If a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old, it speaks to the choice that the Montessori curriculum gives, does not want to build with blocks at a particular time or do a puzzle. Anyone who's been a parent knows it's pretty difficult to get them to do it. So, come back to it another time or find, an activity that will be more interesting. An art activity can be very spatial too. So, I think we have to listen and watch our kids too and build on their interests and skills.
Mukta?
I think it's also for both the questions, a sense of identity that the children are building. And it should not be blocked at this young age. So teachers in a way have to be helped to understand that, okay, if the child goes this way, let the child be, or encourage them to do both things and see where they are. Recently I had a question from a boy that I like Barbie dolls. Is there something wrong about it? He was a 6 or 7-year-old. And he needed that validation from me that it's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But the environment is telling him 100 times that it's wrong. So also for other areas. So how do we encourage in the early childhood learning center how teachers behave, and can we give another kind of an alternative kind of environment where they can be themselves?
So that's an interesting point on this, because my wife does a lot of work on sexuality. And then the fact that it's not just two, boy and girl today, but there are boys within girls, girls within boys, etc. How do you teach that? And how do you break through those barriers, especially among the teachers and the parents, to let kids explore themselves?
Part of our teacher development program, we talk about childhood so that we deconstruct the school in their heads. Otherwise, however much you say how to teach, etc., their old patterns are inside them. So we need to reflect on that and examine those things for each of the teachers. So we help them to look at their own adolescent kind of, experiences, their childhood experiences, and reflect, write on them, make journals, share it in the group. And then we also talk about the idea of Ardhanarishwara is there in India. Ardha, half, Nari is like the male principle, the female principle, and the Ishvara is the male principle. That Ardhanarishwara is in us. So one is dominant in the male and one is dominant in the female, or it can be the other way around. So in each of us, there's something that is dominant. And we talk about it that even to children. Around, say, like when they're about 10 or 11, the boys don't want to touch the girls' stuff. The girls don't want to touch blue because that's for boys. You know, they don't want to touch their desk. Because I think the identity with the sex, their gender is coming up. So then when we talk of this, they become some kind of settled. You know, that I can be, again, you know, be myself rather than what is I get from the environment.
Rukmini?
I mean, I have a slightly broader response to this, that right from whatever the early grade is, and it begins in private schools even earlier, school-like behavior begins even earlier as compared to, let's say, an Anganwadi, which is more a community-based kind of a thing, where you're taught to be individual excellence is given very great importance in our education system. Did you come first in class? Can you do this? You know, when you ask kids in a group, everybody will pick up their hand and say, me, me, me. This is, ingrained as part of our, and so I think that this, there are two parts to this that I think is important. One is, how do you do things as a group starting at a very young age? And what does that being doing things in a group mean? And second thing is, how in that group can you be different kinds of people, or whatever is the diversity. The diversity could be of your orientation, the diversity could be of ability. All of that I think is important, and it's at some level much easier to build it in an early age than at a later age. And so how do you, begin to stress that, this is a group project that you're going to do. Can you draw a picture for people together? Which is not 4 different pictures, but you're working off of the same thing. And I think increasingly as we become polarized and fragmented in society, this knowing how to work with, dissimilar, we play cricket with people who can bowl and people who can bat. And we value that. Why in class does everybody want to be, why does every parent and every teacher say, did you come first?
It's actually an excellent
My parents stopped asking me that question because I never came first.
I just wanted to say that, in life, I think especially the people who went to Booth who are here, you do a lot of group work and learn to negotiate and all that. It's something that kids love to do, and the learning that occurs is amazing. And there's evidence coming out that grouping, when groups of kids are working together, that when you make heterogeneous groups in terms of their skills, both say in that domain, the higher skilled kid learns more because he has to explain to the lower kid skill, and the lower skilled kid also learns more because they're situated with kids who maybe can teach them something, and a teacher can't be everywhere at once. So I think that social learning that occurs in the group is also incredibly important, and something we value as adults.
There's some questions at the back.
We don't want to have a colleague who won't work with us.
You can continue.
Yeah.
So my question is, there was a...
Introduce yourself first.
My name is Anirudh Bose. I'm a Booth alum. So my question is, just hearing all you out, there was a provision in the Right to Education Act for kids to get into any school. So, some of these expensive private schools had to reserve something like 25% for the slum kids in that neighborhood. Now, my question is that, did that thing work? And what would your recommendation be as far as diversity in the background of these who come to school? Is it better to have a diverse thing from an economically, economic situation of that kid, or is it important to have them similar in terms of economic background, in terms of learning? Because you're saying so much emphasis on parents and things.
Anyone?
I think it's good to have diversity, but I don't know how it's working in India. Yeah.
There needs to be a diversity even from economic groups. If you look at, like 60 years ago, there were only government schools mostly, and our parents went to the government school, and the person next door went to a government school, the laborer's father went to a government school. There was a variety at that time. Now with private schools coming in, that diversity is becoming less and less. And even when our schools, perhaps there was more diversity than what is there now. And the Right to Education Act, I think it made a difference. But what the government has realized is that they're paying the private schools to empty out the government schools. So very often the government schools have less enrollment now. And I think the rule that they're going to bring in now is that if there's no government school in your neighborhood, then you can apply for
I'd like to respond to that. I mean, there is, I think even in the morning session, there was what is the role of policy in bringing about change, and what is the role of practice in bringing about a change? And obviously, both go hand in hand. I mean, I've seen schools which were doing this integration well before it became a policy. But as a school culture, as a school community, it doesn't just mean that some children will come in at a certain point and sit in the class with you, or that somebody will pay the fees. If you really want children to be together, then it has to be there is and some of you may know her, there's a school here in Delhi called St. Mary's School. And there they say that, bringing a child into my school, any child into my school, means that I must take care of all the needs of this child. If the child hasn't had a bath in the morning, I must have provision in my school that they can come in the morning and have a bath, because some kids have places where they can have baths at home and some people don't. So it's not just about school. I think it's about what does that community want. And the policy can go, I think, part of the way. My feeling is that the right to education policy did not do enough to support the change in culture that is required. Now, the right to education policy said private schools must take in these kids. Why did we not say that there will be some common activity in a neighborhood which allows all kids, regardless of what school you're in, to do something together? I think that would have hastened whatever kind of people doing things together. In some of the programs that we run in Pratham, we have, for example, in a village, we will have all children in the village of a certain age group in groups in what we call libraries, where it's for everyone. So that we need to, I think, almost self-consciously build every child doing something together than private school children doing this and government school children doing this and whatever other kind of children doing that. And if we want this inclusion and you want the respect of diversity, then it has to be, it can't just be in one place.
Good answer.
I feel when we brought in this activity-based learning, which was, the program was called in Tamil Nadu, when the program was implemented in 37,000 schools across the state, then when it became popular after the first year, and parents were also involved in that, they were invited to come into the class to observe. When they accepted that change, I mean, the change was quite drastic. I mean, in the government schools, class 1 to 4 had a mixed age group, and there was material, and the children worked individually and in groups, whatever, according to their own pace, etc. But the parents bought into that idea, and the children who were in private schools, they came back to the government schools after a year or so. So there was a success story of that marginally those who could not even afford a private school put their children in private schools. But when they saw that the government schools were working well, brought them back.
Sure. So I just want to react to 2 points on this. One is, years back I was at a school conference, and we had this guy from Finland talk about the Finnish method, a guy called Pasi, who wrote a book called The Finnish Way. And I asked him, what lessons can India learn from the Finnish experiment, where in India we have 300 million kids going to school in a broken education system with low capital, whereas Finland has 5 million people totally, and a lot of money. And the first thing he said was, when we started, we had equality in the system. Everyone had equal access, and I think that's an important part about it. So diversity, I think, is very important. The second thing is also at CCS, at Center for Civil Society, we focus a lot on school choice. And it's not so much about private or public, but rather the fact that there is competition, it forces you to improve quality. So for example, as you said, people may have left a public school to go to a private school because of the perception that is better. And if the public school became better, it's great, because then you got a good quality service for free. Why would you not want to take it? So I think these are the important points. Next. Okay. There are too many hands up. Okay. Go to the bald guy in the front here.
Partiality
and
towards bald men.
no more booth alumni to ask a question for some time, okay?
I'm Akshay Sethi.
You're next.
So we were very inspired by the children's museums abroad, and we brought one to India. What we found was that it was great and the kids loved it, but we couldn't find good trainers or teachers to provide and accompany. They were still regimented in their whole mindset about this is the right way to do things. So is there any good resource that you would have that we could use for better training of teachers in an open-ended and experiential learning sort of system?
You know, in the United States, in the preschool sphere, and I think that, you know, would transfer to the museum sphere too, there's a huge emphasis on play-based learning young, and that's what people believe is right, and it's actually hard to convince. Sometimes we make a false dichotomy that you're either playing or you're learning, but you really learn through playing. But, you know, from what I've read, I read this report recently, the India Early Childhood Impact Study, which is very detailed on the fact that in India, it seems like the demand is for, you know, bringing down the elementary school or primary curriculum into, you know, the early, for 3 and 4-year-olds. But the evidence says that that has a negative effect on their later learning and their later achievement. So I think there's sort of a change. You need to have a change in the mindset, and you know, we're talking about government policy, a training of teachers and parents to realize that this approach of, you know, sort of you have to do your, you know, reading, writing, and arithmetic, you know, in this sort of prescriptive way, you know, when you're, you know, before you even get to first grade or we call it kindergarten, is not the way to go. And then all, you know, I think it has to start with teacher training programs. But, you know,
I mean, I had.
It's a cultural thing too.
Well,
though.
but I think that children actually can do quite a lot. I mean, we have.
They
I think
can do it.
in many ways, I feel India is being held up by adults, because if the kids are allowed to really choose, the example I'll give you is we have. As part of the Pratham programs, there's one part which we call our hybrid learning group. These are about 1,000 villages in which there's no instruction. The kids, you know, they go to school, but in the afternoons, they're all part of groups. And they are, you know, usually 10 and above for various reasons. And they have access, they share a tab. Now, they're given projects. It's a bit like what Amukha was describing, that you have an environment. The environment is not got too much instruction.
Right.
And they had, for example, in the summer, they had a project. They were told, you know, everybody in India is making videos at all times. So the 3 topics were mango, water, and games you play. These kids made thousands of videos of all kinds. And the instruction was, make something. So much so that in the village, you had to have juries where you would have screenings of the things that they had made. And then because you could only upload, you know, so many, every group, we had about, in an average village in, say, UP, you had about 10 groups of kids, of 4 or 5 kids each. Each of them produced 10 videos that they thought you should see. I mean, it was just amazing. The only one, after having seen the first round of videos, what we did was we did a little bit of video scripting, little bit of guidelines. And I asked the kids, and maybe there's a boy-girl difference. I remember talking to a bunch of kids, and the boy said, oh, it was fine. We did it, whatever they said they would do it. The girl said, you know, they made us make it tight. The beginning and the end, they made it tight, so that now the story was tighter. Okay, maybe that's a good example. But this is an example where adults were not involved other than in creating just a broad framework. And as the kids saw each other's work, it improved. Now, you know, this is like from these 1,000 villages, we have like a whole archive of mangoes. And the kids' imagination of, you know, some made videos of mom making achar, others made of different, I mean, nobody told them exactly how to do it. They constructed something out of it. And then watching what they did, you could go to the next step. So at some level, I sometimes feel like, you know, drop the trainers, drop the adults, think about how you can create a conducive environment. And maybe if we as adults are getting in the way, then stay out. Just create the conducive environment, step out. And that might lead to much more hands-on experiential learning. The kids were very interesting. I've spoken to a whole bunch of kids. And I said, did you show this in school? So they were horrified. They said, yes, school ka kaam nahi hai. This is the stuff outside. So we also have a big barrier of what is school and school like, and what is mine and what is outside.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Prerna. I'm not a booth alum. I work at the Asar Center. I head the social sector unit, which looks at health and nutrition, not education, but with linkages to education. So my question is, in the health and nutrition domain, the way we think about the health and nutrition of adolescent girls or pregnant mothers, are there examples in the education world where we know of systematic programs at scale with young couples or families expecting children to train them on how their attitudes and what they do with their young children? Because once a child comes in, there's too much to do anyway. So maybe some preparation before may be helpful. And are there examples of that around the world done successfully?
I don't know.
At that scale, I'm not sure, but there certainly are, programs that are trying to do that, kind of thing. One of my colleagues at the University of Chicago, Dana Suskind, has an assessment she gives to, I think, mothers, and it's right after the birth of a baby, while they're still in the hospital. And, it asks questions about, things about child development, what should you do in certain situations, and then they have, sort of an education course while the parents are still in the hospital, mom, baby still in the hospital, and then they reassess, what they've learned. So, there are lots of examples of things like that where people are trying to address, but, I know my own youngest son said to me once, why don't parents, maybe this reflected on me, but why don't parents have to take a class on how to be a parent,
Okay, you got a question, Parth?
Yeah,
we have time for two more, I think. Yeah.
I think focusing on the policy and the practice point that Rukmini made, right? One reason why I think the elementary or primary education is moving downward into the pre-primary, right, is the way the admission process works for colleges, right? So in Indian colleges, only one thing that matters is your percentage in the board exam, right? Nothing else matters in which college you're going to go. Given that policy, in a way, percolates down to the whole practice, right? And I wonder what kind of policy would have to be changed to make the kind of environment we want to create at the pre-primary or even primary level.
I'll just say quickly that I know what you mean. They think that, because you need these skills in order to get into college, that you have to start building those skills, when the kid is 3 years old, But maybe the route to get to, doing well on that test is not doing, exactly working on those skills, starting at 3, but doing the project-based approach and play-based approach that.
I usually ask parents
that
when do you give solid food to children? So they give a certain time, 8 months, etc. So I said, do you give solid food when they're born? You don't. You have to do something different there. So they're ready for certain things at certain ages or certain times in a child's life. So I think we have to follow that kind of a metaphor.
I have a request to the University of Chicago. There used to be, and I was in graduate school very long ago, the set of studies that Jim Stigler and the team did, where they actually looked at classrooms in many different contexts.
Right, we could learn from
And I think that something like that about preschool would be a fantastic thing to do. They did a series of math classrooms in, I think, Taiwan, in Japan, and in America.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating to look at actually how, math is being taught. It also reminds me of a film that was made, I was talking about it last night to someone, called 2 Million Minutes. And I think we should make one like that in India. I don't know if you've seen it. It's 2 million minutes is the number of minutes that you do from 9th grade till the end of high school. And this film, which is about 10 years old, and I think made in America, follows a boy and a girl. So are they different? Comes through there as well. A boy and a girl in the Midwest, somewhere in America, a boy and a girl in Bangalore, and a boy and a girl in Shanghai, and talk to a lot of their parents and sort of school people and policy makers about how they're being prepared for that transition out of school and how it has implications on, what their lives are like. I think that these kinds of cross-cultural kind of deeper looks at how lives work can be very educative, because it's, when you look at the final outcome, it looks like one thing, but what is the process by which, say, from preschool till 3rd grade, you proceed in different cultures would be a fascinating, or even in India actually, would be a very interesting project.
Sounds great. Okay, last question.
Oh, well, like very quickly, just like on the diversity, like just wanted to add, like there is a 2 pieces of very good evidence. Like so, Gautam Rao at who at Harvard now has a very good paper. Delhi West, like RT not just help like the people, like so the student from like rich background get more social and generous. Their education achievement also like goes up. So it's like pretty good evidence there. Also, I think from the US context, Raj Shetty's like a lot of work basically saying that the social mobility of the people. If you have a diverse background and like the diverse neighbors, it's pretty good help. So I think, on the it's not it should matter and there should be papers on it, but like we do have it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have time for anything? Are we done? Sure. Okay. Yes, I know you. How did they let you in? Sorry.
I got a special invitation from Aditi.
Namrata.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much for letting me in. My question was just on scale. And Rukmini, you have such experience on this. Amukha, you're also so impressive. You've done so much on scaling, but it's physical. It's person to person. In today's world, even the project that you just described about leaving it to the child and using video is a different way of using digital and online for children to learn. So in our country where scale and size is so important, what is your view on the role of technology and digital in early childhood education?
You were just talking about it last night. Thanks for that. We'll lather at the last question. Go ahead. I know you have strong views. So.
Well, we've done some research with kindergarten and 1st grade, so 5, 6-year-olds, with a particular app called Bedtime Math. It's freely available. And the app is made it's not like your typical app though you hand a device to a kid and they play with it alone. It's made for parents and kids to do together. And we actually got some interesting results that when, it's like a bedtime story, but it happens to be about math, and that when families engage with this, especially when the parents are math anxious, it raises the kids' math achievement long term, long after they stop using the app. And now we're testing that with a very low socioeconomic group. But the question about apps, this came up earlier about technology. We don't know much about, how it works. We didn't evolve with apps. When I was talking about rotating objects, motor experiences are really important in that. But how about when you go like this on a screen? We don't know if that helps kids in the same way. There's thousands of apps coming out every day, and a lot of them say they're going to help learning. But how does the consumer know which one is and which one does? What should they get? What should they have their kid do? Those are huge questions that are opening up new areas of research, but they do have the potential to scale. And so one of the things we talked about is what's the counterfactual? The best is going to be, in my mind, for little kids interacting with other kids and adults. But what if they're not getting that? Then maybe there is a role for apps.
I think that it's very early days everywhere, and I think that this is not the situation where something that worked in another context can just be Disney and in the Baiju whatever framework may be fine, because that type of kid that is it's being targeted towards maybe is very similar to. But I think what we are learning, and I have some colleagues here in the audience who are working actively on that, is that you need to keep playing with this. And it's not just technology, I think it's a social organization on which it lands. And what is this? So we are doing a lot with groups and devices, but hybrid. It's not just technology. Right. And to me, that it is clear that the arrival of technology in different forms can break certain barriers. So this young mother having access to a tab has an empowerment, and maybe it's just for her, it's not even for the kid. It gives her the space in her family to say, oh, you got a tab from someone, so you must be valuable, so you can have this time with your kid. So I don't think it's about the actual stuff on the technology, but it's the environment that is being enabled because of the arrival of something. Sure. Grandmothers, I've seen grandmothers who are able to do science projects because it didn't require text. you saw, the kids were doing something, you were around. So I think that it has the potential to break certain conventional barriers, whether it will create but you must have access to it. It should, wherever we are working a lot with this hybrid, we make sure that every kid in that environment has access to it in the same way as anybody else. But if the technology access is biased, then it will create new kinds of barriers that perhaps, so we need a case study on this.
Okay. Okay. Okay, thanks a lot for this. Thank you, Amukha and Susan and Rukmini. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Louis.
Thanks a lot for a lovely afternoon.